Polygons. Okay, so we're looking at congruency and their congruent parts. Before we were looking at triangles and their angles and their sides. Okay, now we want to look at congruency. So this is the last lesson before your quiz. Okay, so I'm going to have you take a quiz on Thursday. Okay, so tomorrow you're going to review. Okay, so it's only the 3 lessons that we've gone over so far. That was classifying triangles. Okay, so by their sides and angles, like isosceles or scaling or right or equilateral, stuff like that. And then the stuff we worked on yesterday in that assignment that had to do with angle measures, and then what we're going over today. Okay, so those 3 things. If you need to, make sure you go back and watch the videos on those lessons. Okay, if you were gone or if you don't remember how to do something, watch those videos. They're there for you as a resource. So getting started here. Again, congruent means when 2 figures have the same size and the same shape. Okay, so 2 figures that have the same size or shape. The symbol for congruent, if you forgot, is that equal sign with the squiggle above the top. Okay, so when I say congruent, that's going to be the symbol I'm going to use. So in those pictures, these 3 would be congruent. They're all the same size, they're all the same shape. They don't need to have that same orientation. Okay, so it can be spun to the right or spun to the left or upside down, stuff like that. But it has to have that same size and shape. In the ones on the right here, these ones are not congruent to each other. Okay, this one's larger than the other 2. Okay, in number 6, that angle here is wider than it is in number 5. Okay, so your angles wouldn't be the same. Okay, your sides aren't the same length, stuff like that. Now, 2 polygons are congruent if and only if corresponding sides are congruent and corresponding angles are congruent. Okay, so if your sides and your angles in each are congruent to each other, then those figures are congruent. So in the next few problems here, I want to state the corresponding parts of the 2 congruent triangles. So we know that these 2 triangles are congruent to each other. We want to state their corresponding parts. So for our sides, we want to look at the same number of dash marks. So if I'm looking at side AB, the side congruent to AB would be HJ because both have that single dash mark through them. So I could write this as segment AB is congruent to segment HJ. Okay, so that's how we want to label those sides congruent. Okay, next one I'm going to move on to is BC. Okay, that has 2 dashes through it. So I need to find the other side with 2 dashes through it in my other triangle. That is KJ. So I could write out BC is congruent to KJ. Okay, then the last side would be AC. That has 3 dashes through it. My side in my other triangle with 3 dashes is KH. So I would write this out as AC is congruent to KH. Okay, so those are your 3 sides that are congruent to each other. Now I want to label the angles congruent. Okay, I'm going to start with angle A. Angle A has 2 dashes in that angle. So I want to look at my other triangle and see which angle has 2 dashes. that would be H. Okay, so I could write angle A is congruent to angle H. Okay, so you need that angle symbol there, otherwise it would be labeled as a point. Okay, so you need to show that it is an angle with that angle symbol. Okay, next I'm going to move on to angle B. Okay, angle B has 1, angle J has 1. So we have angle B is congruent to angle J. Then moving on to angle C, that has 3 dashes. Angle K has 3 dashes. So we can say angle C is congruent to angle K. Now, when I ask for a congruence statement, that's talking about the triangles. Okay, so you want to label which triangles are congruent. Now, in this congruent statement, your order is important. Okay, so if I say I'm using triangle ABC, right? I would write triangle ABC. Okay, that's how you label a triangle. No. I don't have any more. Because I only make enough for everybody. So if I label this triangle ABC, I started at point A here. So then I'd have to say it's triangle HJK. So it has to go in that same order of your congruency. So since I started with A in this triangle, I have to start with its congruent angle in the other one. So this would be triangle, I have to go to H first. In this one I went from A to B. Now B had that 1 dash, so I'm going from H to J. And then finally to K. Okay, so for these ones, your order is important. Okay, so when you're doing your congruent statement, your order is very important. So I'm going to highlight that if I can find my highlighter. Okay, so make sure you're doing that congruent statement in that correct order. Okay, I want you guys to do number 2. Okay, so you want to label the sides just like we did in that first one. Except this time, instead of dashes, you're given actual numbers. So you want to look for the numbers that are the same to make those congruent.
Cowboys are pretty good. Oh, easy. Okay. Just kidding. I got homework. Wait, so if one side's for B and then the triangle looks nice for B, then it's going to, okay.
The soft lockdown is complete, so please go back to your normal routine. However, at this time, no one is allowed to leave the building until an all clear is given. Again, the soft lockdown is complete. Please go back to your normal routine. However, at this time, no one is allowed to leave the building until an all clear is given. Thank you.
Can't. There's a dog out there. Oh, it's not like it's gonna bite you. She started having this.
Sure, they would be fine.
Started having this. Yeah, we have a drug overdose in school. Can't this year. That talked to you before we
They were treating this girl in a stretcher, and I was in the hallway like, what is going on? Yeah, he was like,
What?
he was helping, and I was just laying there on the floor. Yeah, he called me.
All right, I'm gonna.
No. They wrapped my head.
Okay. Okay, I'm sorry. Keep going.
Yes. I was like getting so clear, like. I almost did. I was so up. I was not sure for the rest of the day. Was like after the washer. So sweet. Once we started, I tried to do
So you start at J.
yeah, so I had to do M. Oh, so.
Yep. And then you went to yep.
Do I try it over some part of that one too?
No. All right, so the sides I have congruent. Now your sides, you can switch your letters. So say I wrote JL and you wrote LJ, that's the same thing. Okay, so that order isn't super important. You can flip-flop the letters in each of these, but they should be congruent to the same thing. So on mine I have LK is congruent to MQ. LJ is congruent to PQ. And JK is congruent to PM. And again, if you switch K and J, that's fine as long as it's with PM or MP. Your angles, angle L is congruent to angle Q. Angle K is congruent to angle M. And angle J is congruent to angle P. Okay, now here's where you could have a couple different variations. Okay, as long as it's in the right order for what you stated first. So I have triangle LJK is congruent to triangle QPM. Now you don't need it to be exactly this one. You could have also started with letter J. So if you said JKL, that triangle would be congruent to PMQ. I usually give you the first one and you have to tell me what the next one is. Okay, or you could have had, starting with K, KLJ congruent to triangle MQP. Okay, so as long as L is with Q, okay, J has to be with P, and K has to be with M. So here K was still with M, L was still with Q, and J was still with P. Okay, so that's what you're looking for. Shh, Isaiah, go back to your seat. Okay, so any of those is fine. Okay, any one of those that you wrote out is fine. If you have questions about one of them, just let me know and I can tell you if you got it correct. Okay, moving on to number 3. So number 3 is just like the other two problems. Okay, number 3 is just like the other two problems, but instead of a triangle, it's a trapezoid. Okay, it's a quadrilateral, so it has 4 sides instead of 3. Okay, so you're going to do the same process with the sides. You're going to look for that 1 dash mark in both. Okay, those sides are congruent. So I could say BC is congruent to XY. Okay, same thing with the other side. So you guys can do that part by yourself. Once you get to the congruent statement, then I'm going to write that one out with you. Okay, so write out all the sides that are congruent, all the angles that are congruent, given those pictures.
No. Marcia was talking.
Like my morning is so awesome, and then I forget to come back from lunch. I have a really good class, and after that class, I'm like, I'm sorry, there's 3
There is nothing gum on that table.
I'm going to go through that part.
You go A, B, C, D.
That's what I did. W, X, Y, Z. That's all I did.
All right, so it's okay. Check your answers. No, you don't. Check your answers. Again, you could flip-flop your letters, okay? But they should still be congruent to those same sides. Your angles should be correctly stated. Now, for your congruent statement, since there are 4 sides, you're going to have 4 letters that make up that shape. So you don't need to write out a trapezoid for these. You can, that's fine. Usually you write out a parallelogram if it's a parallelogram, but this is not a parallelogram. So we're just going to write out the letters instead. So again, your order is important for this congruent statement. So if I start with A, go to B, go to C, go to D.
Told you.
Okay? That would be congruent to, since I started with A, I'll start with W. I went to B, so I'll go to X, and then to Y, and then to Z. Now, when you do this, it doesn't always go in alphabetical order. Okay? It won't always go in alphabetical order. So sometimes X and Y will be mixed up. Okay? So don't always assume, do not always assume that it is in alphabetical order. Okay? Any questions on the front side? All right, flip it over to the back. Flip it to the back. I know some people are still writing, but flip your paper over to the back when you're ready here. Quiet, please. Okay, on the back, the phrase, we're quiet. The phrase, if and only if, in any definition means that both the conditional and its converse are true. That means that the definition can be read forward and backward. Okay, converse means backwards. Okay, so if it says if and only if, you can take that front part and that back part and you can flip them. Okay, so both sides of that must be a true statement. So if two polygons are congruent, then their corresponding parts are congruent. So for triangles, okay, not for any polygon, just for triangles, we say corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Okay? Or we say C, P, C, T, C. C, P, C, T, C. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Okay, so what that means is if I have two congruent triangles and I know that they're congruent, okay? It's given to me that this triangle is congruent to that triangle, right? Then I could say, well, then I know this side is the same as that side. So their corresponding parts are the same. Okay? Their corresponding parts are the same. So that's what number 4 is doing. Okay? So if you look at number 4 on the left there, you're given this first triangle, CAT, is congruent to this second triangle, RHS. Okay? Yeah. Okay, so you have two congruent triangles. That means their corresponding parts have to be equal or congruent. So what I do when I'm given a problem like this and I have to find these corresponding parts, I draw out those triangles. Okay, so I have two triangles. And I'm going to label those triangles. So the first one, I have CAT. So I'm going to label CAT. Now my second triangle is RHS. Since I started here, I need to start here. I went up to that top vertex for my next letter, so I'll go again up to that top vertex for H, and then finish with S. Okay, so now I know these corresponding parts are congruent. So that means this side will be congruent to this side. So I can label that in my triangle. Same thing with this right-hand side here, AT, should be the same as HS. So I'm going to label that with 2 dashes. Okay, the ones at the bottom then also have to be congruent, so I'll label that with 3. Now I'm going to look at the angles. Okay, angle R and angle C have to be the same. So we're going to put that arc through those angles. Then A and H, put the double arc through those angles. And then the last one is T and S. So we'll put 3 dashes in that angle. Now from this point, I can answer numbers 1 through 6. So I'm looking at angle C, and I want to find the angle that's congruent to that. Well, C's here, R is congruent, so I'll write angle R. Number 2, I have segment RH. So RH is right here. So that would be CA. Make sure you put that segment bar above the top, since that's what we're working with here. You have a segment bar in RH, so you need a segment bar in CA. My next one is CT. That's this side. That same side is RS. Then we have angle S. Okay, that's congruent to angle T. Now we have triangle ACT. So I need my triangle symbol. Don't forget your triangle symbol. I started with A, so I need to start with H.
We are all clear. The canine sniff is complete. We are all clear. The canine sniff is complete. Thank you.
Okay, so since I started with A, I needed to start with H. I went to C, so I'll go to R, and then finally to S for that triangle there. Number 6, the last one, we're looking at HS. That would be AT. This one you do not need a segment bar above the top. Okay, when you have two letters like this, where it doesn't have the segment bar above the top, it's talking about the measure of that segment. Okay, so this is talking about its measure. That's why it's an equal sign instead of a congruent symbol. Okay, it's talking about that segment's measure instead of just the segment itself. Questions on number 4? All right. Then we're going to look at number 5. Okay, so in this diagram, triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DFE. We want to find the values of X and Y. So we can label our triangles with their congruencies. So if I started at A and I started at D, those two angles would have to be congruent. I went from A to B. Okay, so angle B, if I label that with 2 dashes, would have to be congruent to angle F, since I moved from D to F. And then the last angle here, C, would have to be congruent to angle E. So I'll label those two with 3 dashes. Now it's the same thing with their sides. So if I went from A to B, that side would be the same as from D to F. So I can label that with 1 dash mark. I went from B to C then, and then I went from F to E. So those two sides are congruent. And then that last side, AC and DE, would be congruent. Now I want to label my triangles. That way I could set up an equation with equal sides. Okay, so I notice here 8y minus 5. So angle F has 2 dashes and angle B has 2 dashes. So I could set this 8y minus 5 equal to that angle B of 99. Okay, since those two are congruent. So we have 8y minus 5 will equal 99, and we can solve for y. Okay, so add 5. So we have 8y equals 104. Divide both sides by 8. Yeah. So y will be equal to 13. Now I also have this x over here that I need to solve for. In that equation, though, I have this y, right? But I just found what y was. It's 13. So I can plug in 13 for y in this side. So I have 2 times 13 plus x for that side. Now side FE, I need to set that up with something it's equal to solve for x. It is equal to 38.4. Those two sides are congruent. So 2 times 13 is 26. Then I still have that plus x, right? That will be equal to side BC, which is 38.4. Yes. So I can subtract 26 from both sides of that equation. And x should be 12.4. Okay, x is 12.4. All right, at the bottom of this, you just have some theorems. Okay, so if 2 angles of one triangle are congruent to 2 angles of the second, then the third angle must also be congruent. So if you already know these 2 angles are congruent to these 2, then A and L must also be congruent. Your properties of triangle congruence, you have reflexive, symmetric, and transitive. Okay, reflexive property, it's congruent to itself. Okay, symmetry, if triangle ABC is congruent to triangle EFG, then triangle EFG is congruent to ABC. And then your transitive, okay, do you remember what transitive property is? So if I have triangle ABC congruent to triangle EFG, and I also have triangle EFG congruent to triangle JKL, well, since both of those are congruent to EFG, then those 2 triangles must be congruent to each other. Okay? So those are some of the properties with triangle congruence.
Wait, isn't the 17th tomorrow, not Thursday?
Yeah, I forgot to change the date.
What? Let me know when you have your lessons planned for next week. I'm only here Monday, Tuesday.
Maybe that's why it's so good.
I don't want to leave for the whole year. I'm going to be so behind. Huh? I don't know.
Alright, so the first 5 there, you're writing that second part to that congruent statement. You're stating which triangle is congruent to the other one. 6 and 7 are kind of like number 5 on the back. Okay, so identify your congruent angles and sides instead of that equation. Same thing with 8 and 9 and 10. On the back, the quilting one, you just have to name congruent sides and angles. And then again, 12 and 13 are like number 5 on the back of your note sheet. And then 14, draw out those triangles, label them, and then solve. Okay?
No.